Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with tips on critical listening. And today, if you haven't looked at the Tips on Critical Listening playlist, let's put it this way, there's like 15 videos in there. Have a look. There's some really cool discussions, I think, and useful hints on what to listen for in music generally, the aspects of music you should be paying attention to, and then also, how to approach listening in a way so that you get the most out of the experience. And this is one of those talks, how to choose your own reference recording, or what to do with your own reference recording. Now, what is a reference recording? Obviously, if you love classical music and you are getting into it, you're going to notice that everybody's playing more or less the same stuff, unless it's something neglected or really obscure. Usually there are multiple recordings of the same piece, sometimes hundreds of recordings of the same piece. And you may be wanting to hear more than one if it's a piece of music you really love. One of the joys of classical music listening, and one of the reasons we do this, is to make these comparisons between different versions of the same music, because the music is big and even short per pieces. They're multifaceted. Let's put it that way. They allow many different interpretive approaches, and their expressive rewards sometimes can only be enjoyed by averaging out many different versions or views of the music. And it's a fascinating thing. It really is, because music, of course, is not tangible. It exists as sound moving through time, and it can do that in many, many ways. So you're going to have multiple recordings, and you want to decide which ones you like, which ones you don't, which are the better ones, which are the worse ones. The best way to do that, I think, is to triangulate your listening around a version that you know well. Now, for most people, the version they know well is going to be the first one they heard. I get comments all the time where they say, "Wow, this was my first recording and I love it particularly, and it's lovely and terrific and nothing else compares to it." Well, get rid of that notion that nothing else compares to it. If that is your attitude, then forget about critical listening, because there is no such thing as a definitive recording of anything. And there may be many recordings which, if you have an open mind and open ears, will be more satisfying than the one that you first heard. I was never particularly in love with the first recording I got, because, let's face it, the first recording that we get usually happens in a random way. My first recording of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony was Fritz Reiner's with the Chicago Symphony, and it was coupled to Haydn's 88th Symphony, which was why I was listening to the record. The Mozart was just, for me, a filler. I didn't care about it or know it well. And it was in my grandmother's record collection, so I only got to hear it by accident. I would just go through my relatives' record collections, and if I had the opportunity, I would listen to some of the things, and that was a record I listened to. And the Haydn blew me away, and the Mozart didn't interest me at all. But that was my first recording of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, and my encounter with it could not have been more random. It wasn't part of a program scheme of listening. But later, when I started to get into classical music, well, I was always into it, but when I started to collect records actively because I had an allowance or some money, I wasn't like seven, I got the George Szell Jupiter Symphony, and it sounded very different. It was much slower and more deliberate. Reiner's was a zippy performance, quite quick. And I liked the zippitude. I liked the fact that it was fast, because I didn't really like the symphony that much, I have to say. But as time wore on, and I began to enjoy Mozart's Jupiter Symphony and Mozart more thoroughly, I started to realize that, well, there are all these things you could hear that I could hear better in the Szell recording that I didn't hear in the Reiner recording. And so I came to enjoy the Szell recording. I always had a fondness for the Reiner. It's your first love. But don't delude yourself into thinking it's the best, or that there's nothing to be had from listening to other versions. But the Reiner was my reference recording. It was the recording around which I triangulated my listening experience. And, you have to start somewhere. So the thing to keep in mind when you choose your reference recording, that's going to be on the basis of familiarity. It's the version that teaches you the music initially. It may be great, it may not be great. It doesn't matter if it's great or not. What matters is that it gets the job done, teaching you the music initially. So once you know the music initially, how can you make comparisons? What do you do to make comparisons? Well, the idea is to listen for differences between performances and note particularly things that you hear in one version that you don't hear in another. Now, if it's an orchestra, that's pretty easy because orchestras are big and complicated, and sonics and engineering is an art, not a science. And so you can have recordings that are muddy and lousy sounding and recordings that are very transparent and clear, and there may be lots of different things. So you listen, and you listen for the differences. If it's not an orchestral recording, I mean, let's say it's a piano recording, and you're listening to like Chopin's Third Etude. That's always an example because it's so beautiful, and it has that clinching moment. Da 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 ya da da dum ya da 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 dum. From the Opus 10 series. What's it, an E major or something? I don't know. Anyway, it's just that gorgeous melody with that thrilling climax. Well, there, the differences will be voicing, balance between the two hands, timing, lots of timing. Timing is critical. The handling of tempo, when those chords that make you melt come in, dynamics, all of these things will vary from one pianist to another. And in that particular case, well, the version that, gives you a thrill down your spine, that melts you into a puddle of quivering emotional goo, that's going to be the one that you're probably going to come to prefer. Then it may be the one you first heard. It may be that, nothing matches the one you first heard. If that's, the type of person you are, I guess that happens. But I always think that there are different approaches and ways that have, great validity and are very enjoyable to encounter. So you make these comparisons. And as you make the comparisons, you'll find that something fascinating happens, which is that your view of the piece of music, your understanding of what it is, grows and supersedes any individual interpretation. In other words, your sense of the piece is going to be a mixture, an amalgam of the best bits of all the different versions that you've heard. And so when you begin to hear new ones, you have in your mind a series of moments or ideas or sounds or approaches to the piece that will strike you as ideal, that will affect you the most. And you'll maybe grow a little further away from that first one that you heard and that you chose as your reference. But it's very important to have a reference, to have a point of contact and a place to begin so that you can make the comparisons and then draw your own conclusions as to which versions affect you the most and which versions please you the most. I think that let me give you another example of things that you hear. Find a piece that uses a really big orchestra. I like to choose Respighi's The Pines of Rome because it has that final march, and that final march is huge, and it has elements that are different in each recording. First, you've got the pounding rhythm and the timpani and bass drum. It's jump, boom, 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 with the bass drum going thump, dum, dum, thump, dum, 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 thump, dum. And you can hear the bass sometimes you don't hear the bass, sometimes you hear the timpani, sometimes you don't hear the timpani. Then you've got brass coming from all over the place, coming da 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 da, and crashing with the trumpets. It uses extra brass, like in the balconies and things. Da 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 dum ba da 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 dum ba da 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 dum, like that, all over the place. So you want to hear the brass parts. In addition, there is an organ. And balancing the organ with the orchestra is really, really tricky. Sometimes you just hear these grindy organ pedals that blot out the rhythm in the timpani and the bass drum, or you just hear this huge chord, and all the other stuff that the orchestra is doing, and it's doing quite a bit, is almost inaudible. You just hear this, and then you hear sort of the brass going, which is just terrible. But it's a question of balance. It's better actually if you hear less organ. I mean, there should be something there, but adding to the welter of sound. But it's not an organ concerto. I mean, you have to have the brass and percussion. Then you've got the tam-tam crashing in the background. Chung, da da pow, da 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 pow, da 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 pow, like that. It's amazing how many performances you don't hear it at all. You just don't hear it at all. It's just not loud enough. Or everything else is so loud that it's even drowning out the percussion, which is almost insane, but it happens. Modern orchestras can do that. They can play at absolutely deafening volume. And so you have these distinct elements. And my reference recording for the Pines of Rome was always Fritz Reiner, which I also found in my grandmother's record collection. I think it's because they went to Rome. She had a vacation in Rome, and she came back with this disc about, like Rome. So, and she gave it to me, which was even better. So you hear amazing things in that performance. It's got fabulous bass. It's got the tam-tam crashing. All the brass is pellucidly clear. You don't hear much organ. You don't hear a lot of the timpani individually pounding, but you have the bass drum, especially when it starts doubling the timpani after the big cymbal and gong crash. It's thump, 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 like this. It really rocks the room. That's one way to do it. So then you listen to other recordings and you begin to realize that you hear different things in different versions, and you can make up your mind as to which one really pleases you the most. I happen to have been lucky in that particular case because Reiner, it turned out, and sometimes this happens, wasn't just my reference recording, it was the reference recording for the work, along with Toscanini, which was in mono, but which is equally clear. That's the point. That has that same kind of transparency and vividness. And you begin to realize, well, okay, that's what I'm listening for. So then I got 150 other recordings of the piece, and some of them you hear nothing, and some of them, Karajan's second recording, which just sounds like the giant organ chord, with everything sort of, emerging from it like raisins from a tapioca pudding. It's really, really strange. But then Karajan had an earlier recording with the Philharmonia, which is fabulous, where you do have that clarity that I was looking for, not because Reiner did it, because it was my first version, or Toscanini did it, but because Respighi wrote it that way. You begin to realize as you keep listening that the composer had certain things, and those things should be audible. And you want to hear them because they add to the excitement, to the thrill of listening to the whole thing. And so, I started out very luckily with a great reference recording, but if I had a crappy one, and then I heard Reiner, I would know right away, because there was so much other stuff I was hearing, that this at least was probably a superior engineering job. And then you can take into account the tempo and the quality of the playing and all the other things to decide if you think the performance generally is better. But what matters is not your final conclusion about which is best. What matters is the act of listening, the act of making the comparisons and being able to recognize differences and hearing those differences. And yes, you're going to make your judgments. You're going to like what you like and dislike what you dislike. But you want to be able to know this is what the work is, and this is what this performance does. And I can make these comparisons while I'm listening in real time in my mind, because I know it. I know it. And you start with your reference recording. So that is my suggestion about critical listening, in terms of, how you approach multiple versions of the same piece. Listen carefully, make comparisons, pay attention to what stands out, see if those qualities are duplicated in other versions, Make comparisons in real time. Listen to one version right after another if you can. And you can do spot listening. You don't have to play whole hour-long things. You listen to the bits that, really strike you and see if they sound the same. And you'll find a fascinating world opening before you, a vista of auditory delights. And in that process, you will come to find your favorite versions or your own personal version of a work that nobody does to your satisfaction. That's legitimate too, because you are just as qualified to make that determination as anybody who's making records. Trust me on that one. So keep on listening, friends, and enjoy listening critically. Take care.